Welcome. I am Dr. Watson. Thank you for joining on another journey through shadow and memory. Tonight, we revisit the adventure of the Speckled Band, a tale of fear and a mystery waiting beyond the dark halls of Stoke Moran. There are certain mornings which remain untouched by time. Though years have passed since I shared those modest rooms at Baker Street with my remarkable friend Sherlock Holmes, there are occasions when memory returns with such force that I almost fancy I hear again the distant rumble of London carriages beyond our windows. Of all the strange adventures which I witnessed beside him, none lingers more vivap for Winifor Fuzzles Amprus Frigis. It is not merely because death walked so closely beside us in that business, nor because terror wore such an unusual face. Rather, it is because the event seemed to emerge, not from ordinary crime, but from some darker and older corner of the world, a place where fear moved quietly, and reason itself appeared uncertain. I remember the morning well. It was early April of 1883. A pale dawn lingered somewhere beyond the curtains of Baker Street, though I had no wish to greet it. Holmes, as a rule, preferred late rising whenever his work permitted, while I maintained more regular habits owing to my medical training. For that reason alone, my surprise was considerable when I awoke to find him already fully dressed beside my bed. The fire had not yet been lit. Cold grey light edged his lean figure. His sharp features, usually softened by tobacco smoke and morning idleness, were alert with purpose. "Forgive me, Watson," said he quietly, "but necessity has declared war upon comfort." I confess that I blinked at him with something less than enthusiasm. The mantel clock showed barely 7:15. "A catastrophe," I muttered. "Possibly," Holmes replied. "At the very least, a visitor." Even now, I recall the peculiar brightness in his eyes. Holmes possessed many expressions: irritation, amusement, intense abstraction, but there existed another, rarer look, which appeared only when some curious problem had entered his orbit. "A lady," he continued, fastening his cuffs with deliberate care, "has arrived in considerable distress and insists upon seeing me at once. Hudson, who suffered the first assault upon her peace this morning, has naturally transferred the burden upward. A client at this hour, indeed. And when young ladies wander through London before breakfast in evident agitation, I generally conclude that either romance or danger accompanies them. That, I knew, was invitation enough. No pleasure ever rivaled for me the prospect of following Holmes into one of his investigations. I had seen him expose fraud, untangle conspiracies, and penetrate mysteries which seemed hopeless to ordinary minds. Yet I could not know, while dressing hurriedly in that chilly room, that the case waiting us below would become among the most dreadful in all our shared history. We descended together. The sitting room of 21B held its familiar comforts, the chemical apparatus upon the side table, Holmes' violin resting near the chair, scattered papers lying where only he could discover order. But my attention was drawn at once toward the window. There sat a lady, dressed entirely in black, heavy veil, gloved hands tightly clasped, motionless, as though fear itself had frozen her. At our entrance, she rose quickly. Holmes bowed with that mixture of courtesy and observation which never deserted him. "Good morning, madam," said he warmly. "I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is my close friend and associate, Dr. Watson, before whom you may speak with complete confidence." The woman lowered herself uncertainly toward the fire. Holmes paused only a moment before studying her with one of those swift, penetrating glances which I had long since learned to respect. "Mrs. Hudson has wisely lighted the grate," said he. "Pray sit nearer, and perhaps coffee may assist you, for I observe that you are trembling." The woman raised her head. Her voice, when she spoke, was scarcely above a whisper. "It is not the cold that makes me tremble, Mr. Holmes." Holmes leaned forward. "No," and then, with a slow movement, she lifted her veil. What I saw startled me. Her features belonged to a woman still young, yet suffering had laid unmistakable claim upon her. Her face was pale and drawn, streaks of premature grey visible in her hair, and in her eyes lived the hunted expression I had observed only among those driven beyond ordinary endurance. "It is fear," she said softly. "It is terror." And in that moment, before she had spoken another word, I saw Holmes become utterly still. He had recognized it too. This was no ordinary visitor. There are forms of fear which reveal themselves plainly: a startled cry, a trembling hand, the hurried breath of sudden alarm. But the fear carried into our Baker Street rooms that April morning possessed a different quality, altogether deeper. Not the terror of an immediate shock, but the slow exhaustion of one who has lived too long beneath the shadow of something unseen. As the lady sat beside the fire, I observed her more carefully. Though her figure and features suggested a woman still in the strength of life, hardship had laid an unnatural hand upon her. Grey threaded her dark hair long before its proper season, and beneath the veil her face bore that weary tension which physicians sometimes encounter in patients subjected to prolonged distress. Holmes, meanwhile, had settled opposite her with fingers lightly joined beneath his chin. It was his manner to appear almost idle at such moments, though I had seen enough of his methods to know that his mind was rarely more active. He studied her gloves, her sleeves, the hem of her travelling dress, and then, with perfect calm, he spoke. "You have travelled by train this morning." The effect upon our visitor was immediate. She started violently. "You know me, then?" Holmes smiled faintly. "No, madam, but I observe the second half of a return ticket in your left glove. You arrived recently, and must have begun your journey very early." Her astonishment deepened. "That is quite correct." "And before reaching the station," Holmes continued, "you endured a rough drive along muddy roads in the dog-cart, seated upon the left side." I confess that even after years beside him, such deductions still afforded me quiet delight. The lady stared openly. "How could you possibly know that?" Holmes gestured gently toward her sleeve. "The mud upon your jacket tells the story. 7 fresh splashes, all upon the left arm. A dog-cart alone throws mud in so distinctive a fashion." For the first time a faint expression, something between wonder and relief, softened her troubled features. Your reputation has not exaggerated your gifts, Mr. Holmes. My methods are simpler than they appear, said he. But please, tell us what has brought you to Baker Street with such urgency. The woman hesitated. Her hands tightened together. Outside, London had begun to stir awake. Through the window drifted the distant sounds of wheels and hoofbeats, softened by morning mist. Yet within our sitting room, the atmosphere seemed strangely enclosed, as though the ordinary world had withdrawn. At last she spoke. "My name is Helen Stoner." She paused briefly. "And I live with my stepfather at Stoke Moran." At the mention of that name I noticed Holmes' eyelids narrow almost imperceptibly. "The Roylotts?" he asked. "Yes." Holmes inclined his head. "I am familiar with the family." Miss Stoner lowered her gaze toward the fire. "The family was once among the oldest and wealthiest in England, but ruin came gradually. Estates were squandered. Generations wasted their inheritance through vice and gambling, until almost nothing remained." Her voice carried neither pride nor bitterness, only fatigue. "The ancient house still stands," she continued, "though much of it has fallen into decay. My stepfather, Dr. Grimesby Roylott, is the last survivor of that line." At this name, an uneasy sensation touched me, though I could not then have explained why. There are certain names which seem to arrive accompanied by warning. Helen Stoner continued. "Roylott studied medicine and travelled to India, where he established a successful practice in Calcutta. It was there that he married my mother, the widow of Major General Stoner of the Bengal Artillery." As she spoke, her eyes remained fixed upon the flames. "My sister Julia and I were twins. We were very young when our mother remarried." Her voice grew quieter. After some years in India, something changed. Holmes remained silent. He never hurried a witness. "In a violent dispute following robberies at his residence," she said carefully, "my stepfather beat his Indian butler so severely that the man died. I felt myself stiffen. He narrowly escaped execution and served a prison sentence before returning to England." The room fell still. Even Holmes' expression darkened. "After our return," she continued, "my mother died in a railway accident near Crewe. That was 8 years ago." The sorrow in her tone seemed genuine still. "With no reason to remain in London, Dr. Roylott brought us to Stoke Moran." Holmes' voice was quiet. "And life there?" For several moments she did not answer. Then she looked up. I shall never forget her expression. "It became unbearable." The words emerged almost reluctantly. At first the neighbouring families welcomed the return of a Roylott to the ancestral home, but my stepfather withdrew from society entirely. He quarrelled with anyone who crossed him. She lowered her voice. His temper became dreadful. The fire shifted softly. "He is a man of enormous strength," she said, "and when anger seizes him, he scarcely appears human." I exchanged a glance with Holmes. There was something carefully restrained in her account, as though she hesitated to reveal the full truth. "Violence," she said quietly, "seems almost hereditary among the Roylotts." Her hands trembled again. "There were fights, police matters, disputes throughout the village." Then, after a pause, "The people fear him." Holmes leaned slightly forward. "And you, Miss Stoner?" The question lingered. Her eyes moved toward the fire. When she answered, her voice had become scarcely audible. "I fear him very much." And though she had not yet spoken a word concerning death, mystery, or the purpose of her visit, I felt already that some dreadful history waited behind those words. Something still hidden, something she had scarcely gathered courage enough to tell. There are houses, I have often thought, which seem to absorb the character of those who dwell within them. One may enter such places and feel at once whether laughter or sorrow has long inhabited the walls. A cheerful home carries warmth even in silence. Yet there are others where some older gloom appears, settled deep into timber and stone, until the building itself seems burdened by memory. As Miss Helen Stoner continued her account that morning in Baker Street, I found my imagination wandering unwillingly toward Stoke Moran. I pictured ancient corridors, weather-stained walls, windows staring blankly across neglected grounds, and Helen sat motionless beside our fire, the dancing glow catching faint silver strands to her prematurely whitened hair. "My stepfather," she said quietly, "was not always the man he became." Holmes remained perfectly attentive. "India altered him," she continued, "or perhaps prison did. I cannot say which carried the greater influence." Her fingers tightened around one another. "When we settled at Stoke Moran, there still seemed hope of a peaceful life. My mother had left sufficient means for our comfort, and for a short while we imagined ourselves secure." She gave a faint, weary smile, but peace did not remain long. Outside Baker Street, morning traffic had strengthened, though its sounds reached us only faintly. Within our sitting room, the world seemed narrowed to her voice alone. The old house, she said, stood surrounded by a few remaining acres of neglected land. Much of the estate had long since been lost through debt, and only fragments of former grandeur survived. I imagined ivy-covered walls and sagging roofs beneath the pale Surrey sky. "At first," Helen continued, "our neighbours attempted kindness. They visited and invited us among them. Many were genuinely pleased to see the Roylott name return to its ancestral home." She lowered her eyes, but my stepfather rejected every effort. Holmes steepled his fingers. He withdrew entirely. Yes, her answer came immediately. He shut himself away and became increasingly suspicious of all company. Weeks might pass without his entering the village, except when anger or necessity compelled him. She hesitated. An anger came often. The shadows cast by the fire trembled softly against the walls. I had already gathered something of the doctor's nature from her earlier words, yet the picture now forming proved darker still. "His temper," she said, "was notorious throughout Surrey. There existed no exaggeration in her tone, only fact. Twice he appeared before magistrates after violent quarrels. Men crossed the road to avoid him. Children fled at the sound of his approach. Holmes asked quietly. He possessed unusual strength? Helen gave a faint nod. Extraordinary strength. Her voice remained calm, though memory clearly troubled her. Only last week he seized the village blacksmith during an argument and hurled him bodily over a parapet into a stream. I could not suppress a movement of surprise. She noticed. I prevented further scandal only by paying compensation from what little money I could gather. Holmes' expression grew thoughtful. And no friends? None, said she. Then, after a moment, none except gypsies. At this, Holmes' eyes lifted slightly. The word hung curiously in the room. Gypsies, he repeated. They camp upon portions of the neglected estate. Her voice carried mingled discomfort and resignation. My stepfather permits them free use of the grounds, and often visits their encampments. Sometimes he disappears among them for days together. I remember glancing toward Holmes. Already his mind had begun arranging these details. Ancient house, violent physician, wandering gypsies. Yet stranger elements still remained. There is another peculiarity, Helen said. Holmes inclined his head. My stepfather possesses an unusual fondness for animals brought from India. Now I confess I felt a slight curiosity. Exotic animals? I asked. Yes, doctor. A faint shudder crossed her features. At present, he keeps both a cheetah and a baboon upon the grounds. Even Holmes raised his brows. They wander freely. They do. The matter appeared to distress her considerably. No servant remains with us long. The creatures roam as they please, and the villagers fear them nearly as much as they fear their owner. I found the image unsettling beyond measure. A decaying ancestral house, gypsy fires among the trees, and prowling somewhere across neglected lawns, creatures belonging not to Surrey, but to distant jungles. Helen continued. My sister Julia and I lived quietly and with little society. There were no companions near our own age. Few visitors cared to come. Her voice softened. So we had one another. There was affection in those words, a tenderness which immediately struck me. We were twins, she said, and perhaps twins share a bond difficult to explain to others. I noticed that her hands had become very still. For years we managed the household ourselves, for servants seldom stayed. The strain altered us both. She gave a small, sorrowful smile. Julia was scarcely 30. Her fingers touched her own greying hair, and already age had begun to claim her. Holmes spoke gently. Your sister is dead. The question lingered. Helen looked toward the fire. For several seconds she did not answer. When at last she spoke, her voice had changed. Quiet, fragile. She died 2 years ago. I remember that a sudden heaviness settled over the room, not merely grief, something colder. And though the morning light had strengthened beyond our windows, I felt strangely as though the shadows around us had deepened. Holmes said nothing. He understood, as did I, that we had reached the true threshold of her story. Lynn drew a slow breath. We had a one relative. she said. "My mother's sister, Miss Noria Westphale, who lived near Harrow. Occasionally we visited her." A faint warmth touched her expression. It was during one such visit at Christmas that Julie met a gentleman, a half-pay major of Marines. Holmes listened carefully. They became engaged? Yes. The faint warmth vanished. "My stepfather did not oppose the match." She paused. "And for a little while we believed happiness had at last found us." The fire crackled softly. Then came the sentence which altered the very air within Baker Street. "But scarcely 2 weeks before the wedding," she whispered, "Julia died." No sound followed, only silence. And I recall that Holmes, who had remained leaning easily in his chair throughout her narrative, slowly opened his eyes and regarded her with complete attention. For now we had reached the heart of fear, and the dead, though absent, had entered the room with us. There are moments in certain narratives when the air itself seems to change. So it was in our Baker Street rooms, as Miss Helen Stoner spoke the words, "My sister died." Until then we had listened to a history dark enough in itself. An ancient family reduced to ruin, a violent stepfather, and a lowly house shadowed by fear. Yet now, for the first time, death entered the room. The morning fire crackled softly between us. Outside, London had fully awakened, though its distant sounds reached us faintly, as though separated by some invisible curtain. Holmes remained very still. He had leaned back with eyes partly closed, while Helen described the Roylotts and Stoke Moran, but now his attention sharpened visibly. "Pray, be precise," said he quietly. Helen lowered her eyes. "I can be precise, Mr. Holmes." Her voice every forth, every detail of that dreadful night remains fixed in my memory. The firelight trembled gently upon her veil. The inhabited portion of Stoke Moran contains 3 bedrooms upon the ground floor. My stepfather occupies the first, Julia the second, and my own chamber lies beside hers. Holmes nodded. "All opening into the same corridor?" "Yes." "And communicating with one another?" "No." "Very good." Helen gathered herself before continuing. "The windows overlook the lawn, while the doors open only toward the corridor. We always locked ourselves inside at night. I confess this detail struck me. Because of your stepfather?" I asked. She shook her head. "Partly because of his strange animals." Then she explained. Dr. Roylott's fascination with exotic creatures had followed him home from India. A cheetah and a baboon roamed freely across the estate, and, on occasion, even near the house itself. We never felt entirely safe unless our doors were locked. The image unsettled me greatly. A lonely manor, wild animals beyond dark windows, and somewhere within those walls, an unpredictable master. Helen continued. On the evening before Julia's death, my stepfather retired early to his own room. Her expression tightened slightly. He had not gone to sleep, however. My sister could smell his Indian cigars through the walls and disliked the odor intensely. Thus, unable to rest, Julia had come to Helen's room. I remember the softness which entered Helen's voice while speaking of her twin. For all the sorrow surrounding the tale, affection remained alive within memory. She sat with me for some time, Helen said. Speaking of her approaching marriage, I imagined the scene as she described it. Two sisters together in the quiet of an old house. An oil lamp burning low, rain beginning beyond the windows. One looking toward happiness, neither suspecting how little time remained. It was near 11 o'clock when she rose to leave. Helen paused, then added, but before reaching the door, she turned back, her eyes lifted toward Holmes. She asked me a strange question. Holmes inclined his head. What question? Helen's voice became almost a whisper. Tell me, Helen, have you ever heard anyone whistle during the night? The question hung curiously in our sitting room. And had you? Holmes asked. No. Her hands tightened together. Julia told me that during several recent nights she had heard a low, clear whistle. At what hour? About 3 in the morning. Holmes said nothing. The fire crackled softly. She believed the sound came either from the next room or from outside, upon the lawn. Helen had dismissed it then. Perhaps, she suggested, the gypsies camping upon the estate made such noises. Julia herself had seemed uncertain, yet the matter had evidently troubled her. At last, Helen said quietly. She smiled and wished me good night. I noticed her fingers tremble. She closed the door. A pause, and I heard the keys turn in the lock. Holmes leaned slightly forward. You are certain of this? Entirely. His expression remained unreadable. Pray continue. Helen drew a slow breath. That night I could not sleep. Outside Baker Street, a carriage rattled faintly past. Yet within our room, silence deepened. I cannot explain the feeling, she said, except to say that some vague sense of danger oppressed me. She looked toward the fire. My sister and I were twins, Dr. Watson. You may understand how certain sympathies exist between such souls. I nodded. As a physician, I had often observed peculiar emotional bonds difficult to dismiss entirely. The weather had grown wild, Helen continued. Wind battered the house, rain struck the windows. And then her voice faltered. Suddenly, I heard it. The room itself seemed to hold its breath. A scream. No dramatic gesture accompanied the word, only memory. A woman's scream, she whispered. Terrible, filled with fear. She knew instantly whose voice it was. I saw again, in imagination, the storm-dark corridor, the sudden terror. Helen leaping from bed and wrapping a shawl about her shoulders. As I opened my own door, she said, I thought I heard another sound. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Yes, a whistle. The word fell heavily, low, very low. She swallowed, and then her face had grown pale. A metallic sound. Holmes did not interrupt. I ran into the corridor. The storm outside Stoke Moran seemed almost visible in her voice. My sister's door stood open, swinging slowly. I confess I felt a chill. Helen stared into the fire as though seeing it again. Then Julia appeared. Her voice trembled now. She looked dreadful, her face white with terror. hands stretched forward as if seeking help. I imagined the oil lamp casting shadows across her convulsed figure. She staggered toward me. Helen pressed trembling fingers together. I caught her. For a moment, emotion overcame her. Then softly, she collapsed. Convulsions shook Julia violently. At first, she failed to recognize her sister. Then suddenly, with desperate effort, she cried out words Helen had never forgotten. "Oh my God, Helen!" The fire snapped softly. It was the band. Helen's voice fell almost inaudibly. The Speckled Band. No one spoke. Even Holmes remained motionless. "She tried to say more," Helen whispered. "She pointed toward my stepfather's room." Then came another convulsion, and speech ended forever. The room at Baker Street had grown utterly still, for now the mystery stood before us plainly: a locked chamber, a dying woman, a whistle in the night, and the final, impossible words, the Speckled Band. I have often observed that Holmes possessed two remarkable qualities which seldom dwelt together in the same man. The first was reason, the second, restraint. Where another might be carried away by outrage or alarm, Holmes became calmer still, as though danger itself sharpened rather than disturbed his faculties. Thus it was. After Miss Helen Stoner concluded her dreadful account of her sister's final night, for a time our sitting room at Baker Street remained very quiet. The morning fire burned low. Helen sat with lowered eyes, exhausted by confession, while Holmes leaned back with fingertips set together beneath his chin. His lids were half closed, yet I knew the appearance deceived. Behind that stillness, his mind moved swiftly. At length, he spoke. "This is a most singular business." His voice carried neither excitement nor disbelief, only thought. "There are details," said he, "which require careful examination before any conclusion may be safely drawn." Helen looked toward him anxiously. "You believe me, then?" "My profession," Holmes replied gently, "has taught me that facts deserve patience before judgment." He paused. "But there is one matter upon which you have not been entirely candid." The effect was immediate. Miss Stoner stiffened. Her face lost what little colour remained. I do not understand." Holmes leaned forward. "You are protecting your stepfather." I remember her expression vividly. Not anger, fear, almost instinctive fear. Why should we say such a thing? Without answering directly, Holmes reached forward with surprising delicacy and lifted the black lace edging resting across her wrist. There, against pale skin, stood unmistakable marks, 4 bruised finger impressions, and the shadow of a thumb. Even before Helen drew back, I had seen them plainly. As a medical man, I required no explanation. Holmes released her hand at once. "You have been badly handled." For several moments she said nothing. Then, colouring deeply, she hid the injured wrist within her sleeve. "He is a powerful man," she said quietly. "Sometimes he scarcely knows his own strength." The words struck me more painfully than any dramatic accusation might have done. One excuses strangers, one excuses enemies. But such excuses, offered for cruelty within one's own household, reveal a life long accustomed to fear. Holmes said nothing further upon the matter. Instead, he rose and paced once toward the window. Outside, London had fully awakened now, though the familiar city noises seemed strangely distant. At length he turned. "Miss Stoner, should Roylott leave Stoke Moran today? Would it be possible for us to examine the house without his knowledge?" She nodded eagerly. "He intends to travel to London this morning, upon business. He may remain absent until evening." "Excellent." Holmes glanced toward me. "You are willing, Watson?" "Entirely." "Excellent." Holmes glanced toward me. "You are willing, Watson?" "Entirely." And indeed, by this stage my own curiosity and uneasiness had grown considerably. Holmes resumed. "We shall accompany you this afternoon. Until then, I have certain inquiries to pursue." Helen rose, relief and uncertainty mingled in her face. "You truly think something may be done?" Holmes' expression softened. "I think," said he, "that fear grows most dangerous when endured alone." Those words seemed to steady her. She lowered her veil once more and departed, leaving behind an atmosphere curiously altered by her absence. The door had scarcely closed before I turned to Holmes. "Well?" He remained standing beside the fireplace. "A dark affair, Watson. You suspect the stepfather?" "I suspect everything." His eyes wandered thoughtfully toward the window. "The locked room presents difficulties. The whistle presents difficulties. The Speckled Band present greater ones still." I seated myself opposite him. "And the gypsies?" "Possibly irrelevant, but you do not sound convinced." Holmes smiled faintly. "My dear fellow, conviction's a luxury reserved for those with insufficient facts." He had scarcely spoken these words when a violent interruption shattered our discussion. The door burst open. I do not employ the phrase lightly. It burst inward with such force that it struck the wall behind. Framed in the doorway stood the most formidable man I had seen in many years. He was enormously tall. His broad shoulders nearly filled the entrance itself. A black top hat sat upon his head, while his clothing formed an odd mixture, country gentleman and professional man. Long coat, gaiters, and in one hand a hunting crop. Yet it was not his size alone which seized my attention. His face bore the harsh stamp of violent passions long indulged, deeply lined, sun-darkened, and dominated by fierce, yellowish eyes, with which seemed to burn from beneath heavy brows. He reminded me irresistibly of some dangerous bird of prey. His gaze moved from Holmes to myself. "Which of you is Holmes?" Holmes remained seated. "My name, sir." The newcomer advanced one pace. "I am Dr. Grimesby Roylott." Holmes inclined his head. "Indeed. Pray sit down." "I shall do no such thing." The voice crashed through the room. "My stepdaughter has been here. I followed her. What has she told you?" Holmes regarded him pleasantly. "The weather remains unusually cold for April." Rollitt's face darkened. "What has she told you?" "I have heard," said Holmes calmly, "that the crocuses promise well this season." The doctor stepped forward with alarming violence, shaking his crop. "You think to mock me?" His fury filled the room like heat from an open furnace. "I know your reputation. You are Holmes, the meddler." Holmes smiled. "Holmes, the busybody." The smile broadened. "Holmes, the Scotland Yard Jack-in-Office." To my astonishment, Holmes laughed outright. "Your conversation is extremely entertaining." Then, quite mildly, "When you leave, Doctor, kindly close the door There is a draught. For a heartbeat, I feared Roylott might strike him. Instead, the man lunged toward the fireplace. "I am dangerous to cross," he snarled, and seizing the heavy steel poker resting beside the grate, he bent it with his bare hands. The metal curved grotesquely. I rose involuntarily. Roylott hurled the twisted iron into the hearth. "Keep yourself out of my affairs." Then, with one final glare, he strode from the room. The door slammed behind him. For several seconds, neither Holmes nor I spoke. Then Holmes rose quietly. "He seems," said he, "a very amiable gentleman." And, to my amazement, he lifted the bent poker. His face hardened. With a sudden effort, he straightened the steel once more. The iron groaned beneath his grip. Holmes replaced it beside the grate. "This incident," said he softly, "adds interest to our investigation." Then his eyes grew grave. "And I fear our poor client may have more cause for terror than even she suspects." When Dr. Grimesby Roylott had at last thundered from our rooms, and the echoes of his departure faded down Baker Street, an uneasy stillness remained behind him. It was as though some violent storm had briefly entered our chambers, passed on, leaving the air disturbed in its wake. Holmes, however, betrayed little concern. He merely dusted his hands with mild satisfaction, after straightening the poker, and resumed his seat near the fire. I confess I watched him with growing curiosity. "You appear remarkably untroubled," said I. "My dear Watson," he replied, "bluster is often intended to disguise uncertainty. Men who threaten loudly are not invariably the most dangerous." "You do not believe Roylott dangerous?" Holmes reached for his pipe. "On the contrary," said he calmly, "I believe him exceedingly dangerous." The distinction, though subtle, was not lost upon me. For the next hour, Holmes withdrew into one of those periods of concentrated reflection familiar to all who knew him. He smoked in silence, eyes half closed, while I attempted without success to untangle the perplexing facts before us. A locked chamber, a dying woman, a whistle in the darkness, and those strange final words, the Speckled Band. By late morning, Holmes rose with sudden energy. "I have one errand remaining," said he, reaching for his coat. "Oxhurst Commons may provide illumination." He departed briskly, leaving me to my own thoughts. It was nearly 1 o'clock when he returned. I knew immediately from his expression that his excursion had proved useful. He carried a folded blue document covered with figures and notes. "Well?" I asked. Holmes removed his gloves. "I have examined the late Mrs. Stoner's will." He laid the paper upon the table. "Financial matters are frequently more revealing than sentiment." I drew nearer. "The mother possessed considerable means. At the time of her death, the estate yielded somewhat, over £1,100 annually, though declining agricultural values have since reduced the income." He tapped the figures. "The essential point, Watson, is this. Upon marriage, each daughter becomes entitled to a substantial allowance." I looked up, and Roylott, Holmes's expression grew thoughtful, "would suffer accordingly." The meaning became plain. "If both daughters married," said I slowly, "he would find himself living upon a fraction of his present income." Holmes folded the document. One daughter alone would inconvenience him seriously. Two might ruin him altogether. The room fell quiet. At last, the matter possessed motive, dark motive. And though motive proves nothing by itself, it may cast an unpleasant light upon otherwise obscure behaviour. Holmes fastened his coat. Our morning has not been wasted. You suspect him more strongly now? I distrust coincidence, said Holmes, and I distrust violence supported by financial advantage. He moved toward the door. But suspicion alone is smoke. We require flame. Within half an hour, we found ourselves bound for Waterloo Station. Holmes had advised me, with unusual seriousness, to bring my revolver. An alien number 2, said he, is occasionally a persuasive companion. The request, coupled with Roylott's earlier display of strength, lent to our excursion a gravity I could not ignore. Waterloo. We secured passage toward Leatherhead. I have always cherished railway journeys through the English countryside, and even now memory carries me back to that afternoon with curious clarity. Spring had only recently awakened. The sky shone pale and bright above drifting clouds, while the hedgerows displayed their earliest green. Fields stretched peacefully beneath sunlight. Fresh earth carried that rich scent which follows winter rains. Yet, against such tranquil beauty, our errand appeared strangely out of place. Holmes sat opposite me in the carriage, hat tilted low and arms folded. He spoke little. Only once, after long silence, did he glance upward. "There is something peculiarly sinister," said he, "when evil hides itself beneath domestic routine." I waited. "A battlefield announces danger plainly," he continued. "But within households, among bedrooms and family ties, wickedness may wear gentler clothing." Then he lapsed once more into thought. At Leatherhead, we hired a small trap and driver. The journey from station to Stoke Moran carried us through winding Surrey lanes bordered by budding trees and damp meadows. Birdsong drifted across the fields. Sunlight flashed among branches. And yet, despite nature's quiet charm, I found my uneasiness deepening. Holmes remained silent until suddenly he touched my sleeve. "Look there." I followed his gaze. Across gently rising grounds stood a wooded park. Among the trees, partially obscured by branches, appeared the roof and weathered gables of an old manor house. Even at distance it presented a melancholy aspect, grey, ancient, brooding. Our driver nodded toward it. "That will be Stoke Moran, gentlemen. Dr. Roylott's place." I studied the structure carefully. One wing appeared damaged, roof sagging, and windows boarded. The central portion showed neglect, though smoke drifting from chimneys suggested habitation somewhere within. "There is work being done," Holmes observed. Indeed, scaffolding clung to part of the building, yet even from afar, something about the repairs struck me as strangely incomplete. The driver pointed again. "There is the village yonder, but if you're heading for the house, shorter to cross these fields." And then I saw her, a solitary female figure moving near the path. "Helen Stoner." Holmes smiled faintly. "Our client awaits us." We dismissed the trap and crossed the stile. As we approached, Helen hurried forward. Relief transformed her face. "You have come." "As promised," said Holmes warmly. The gratitude in her expression touched me, for beneath it lay unmistakable tension. "All has gone well," she said quickly. Roylott left for London shortly after morning. Holmes nodded. "We had the pleasure of meeting him ourselves." Her colour vanished. "He followed me, so it would appear." For a moment fear clouded her features. Then Holmes reassured her gently. "He must be cautious. There are occasions when hunters discover themselves pursued." We continued together across the grounds, and as Stoke Moran loomed larger before us, I felt a curious chill, despite the mild afternoon. The house seemed less a home than a wounded relic, grey-stoned, darkened by age, crooked lines, shadows beneath sagging eaves, and surrounding it all, a silence which I found difficult to explain. It was then, while studying the old manor rising before us, that I first experienced the uneasy conviction that we approached not merely mystery, but danger. As we crossed the neglected grounds of Stoke Moran beside Miss Helen Stoner, I found myself studying the old manor with increasing unease. Age alone does not render a house sinister. Indeed, many ancient homes possess noble tranquillity earned through generations of life and memory. Yet Stoke Moran offered no such welcome. Its stone walls bore the stains of weather and neglect. One wing sagged visibly beneath time's burden, windows boarded and roof partially collapsed, like the ruins of some forgotten abbey. The central portion showed little greater care, though smoke rising faintly from one chimney revealed that part of the house remained inhabited. The place resembled an old creature injured, but still alive. Holmes slowed his pace and surveyed the building with narrow, thoughtful eyes. The afternoon had grown mild, and sunlight lay softly upon the lawns, though somehow the warmth seemed unable to soften the melancholy surrounding the estate. "There," said Helen, pointing toward the inhabited wing. "Those are the rooms." Holmes followed her gesture. 3 windows faced the lawn, plain, closely spaced, at first glance entirely ordinary. "The first belongs to Dr. Roylott," she explained. "The middle was my sister's, and is now mine. The third was formerly my own." Holmes nodded slowly. "And you moved only recently?" "Yes." "Because of the repairs?" His gaze shifted toward the scaffolding. I noticed a faint crease appear between his brows. "These repairs seem remarkably modest." Helen lowered her voice. "There was no real necessity for them." Holmes glanced sideways. Indeed, she hesitated. "I have often suspected they served merely as an excuse to move me into Julia's room." The remark seemed to interest him greatly. Without reply, he began pacing slowly across the lawn. I had seen that peculiar walk before, head slightly inclined, hands clasped behind his back. To casual observers it might appear idle wandering, but I knew Holmes measured and observed continuously. Presently he halted beneath the windows. "Your former room?" he asked. Helen indicated the far chamber, and the middle one, the room of your sister's death. She nodded. Holmes spent several minutes examining the exterior with extraordinary care. He studied the shutters, the masonry, the hinges, even the ground beneath. At length he requested, "Would you kindly close and fasten the shutters from inside?" Helen entered obediently. Moments later, the window stood barred. Holmes approached immediately. To my surprise, he attempted, with considerable force, to open the shutters from without. The effort failed entirely. He produced his lens, examined bolts and ironwork, tested crevices. Nothing. "These are secure," said I. "Very." He scratched his chin thoughtfully. "No knife could pass here. No hand either." For several moments he stood silent. Then, "Interesting." His tone, however, suggested complication rather than satisfaction. At last we entered through a narrow side door and found ourselves within the corridor serving the bedrooms. It proved a modest passage, whitewashed and dim, its small windows admitting only softened daylight. Holmes declined to inspect Helen's former room. "We begin," said he, "where the tragedy occurred." Thus we entered the middle chamber. I remember it clearly, a low ceiling, ancient oak panels darkened by age, a wide fireplace and simple furnishings arranged with modest country comfort. Nothing within appeared immediately remarkable. A narrow bed stood against the wall. Nearby rested a dressing table and small chest of drawers, 2 wicker chairs, and a square carpet completed the furnishings. Indeed, had I entered without prior knowledge, I might have considered it merely an old-fashioned bedroom. Holmes, however, became strangely intent. He said little, only drew a chair into the corner, and sat observing. His eyes travelled steadily, walls, floor, ceiling, bed. Then, quite suddenly, "That bell rope." I followed his gaze. A thick cord hung beside the bed, its tassel resting conveniently upon the pillow. "It communicates with the housekeeper?" he asked. Helen shook her head. "So I believed, though we rarely used it." "Recently installed?" "2 years ago." The date seemed to arrest him. Curious. He stood, and, to my surprise, grasped the cord. A sharp tug followed. No sound. Holmes looked up. "Why," said he softly, "this bell does not ring." Helen blinked. "What do you mean?" "It is not connected." I approached. Indeed. The core ended above, fastened merely to a hook beside small ventilator. No wire, 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 no wire. Holmes' expression grew difficult to read, most singular. He examined the arrangement closely. The ventilator itself proved equally peculiar, small, recently made, and opening not toward fresh air, but directly into the adjoining room, Dr. Roylott's room. I confess the arrangement struck me as absurd. "A builder's folly," I suggested. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he crouched upon the floor with lens in hand. Never had I witnessed more painstaking examination. He inspected cracks between boards, panel seams, corners, even the underside of furniture. At last he rose and stood beside the bed. Then came the discovery, which altered his manner completely. "Watson," said he quietly, "observe this." I looked. At first I saw nothing, then understanding dawned. The bed. It could not move. Its frame had been clamped securely to the floor. I stared. That is unusual. Highly unusual. Holmes remained motionless several moments. His gaze moved slowly upward, from fixed bed to bell rope to ventilator. Something changed in his expression then. Not excitement, not triumph, but rather a dark concentration which unsettled me more than other. Helen watched anxiously. "Do you see something wrong?" Holmes turned toward her. "One or two details," said he. His voice sounded remarkably quiet. "Details which interest me greatly." We passed next into Dr. Roylott's chamber, larger, plainly furnished, books, a camp bed, wooden chair, round table, and dominating one corner, an iron safe. Holmes examined everything, then paused before a small saucer of milk resting atop the safe. "A cat?" he asked. "No, but there is milk." Helen gave a faint, nervous smile. "The cheetah, perhaps." "Ah, yes." Holmes crouched beside the wooden chair, near the ventilator, studying its worn seat carefully. Then his eye lifted toward an object hanging from the bedpost, a dog-lash, yet strangely tied. Its whipcord formed a small loop. Holmes removed it gently. I saw his face darken. "What do you make of that?" he asked. "A lash," said I. "Yes," he murmured, "but not merely a lash." He replaced it carefully. And though he spoke lightly a moment later, I noticed something profoundly altered in him. We returned outside. For several minutes, Holmes paced the lawn in silence. His face had grown grave. At last he stopped before Helen. "Miss Stoner," said he, "your life may depend entirely upon obedience." Her face paled. "I shall do exactly as you ask." Holmes nodded. "Then tonight," said he quietly, "Dr. Watson and I must not occupy your room." And at those words, though sunlight still lay upon Stoke Moran, I felt the shadow of coming darkness settle unmistakably around us. I have sometimes wondered whether Holmes already knew the truth while we still stood upon the lawn at Stoke Moran. He never admitted as much. Indeed, my friend possessed too disciplined a mind to embrace certainty before evidence compelled it. Yet there are occasions when instinct, sharpened by experience, travels ahead of proof, and as we walked slowly beneath the fading afternoon light, I sensed that his thoughts had settled upon some dreadful possibility. Miss Helen Stoner watched him anxiously. The breeze stirred the untended grass around us, and beyond the old walls the countryside lay peaceful beneath the gentleness of spring. Yet peace seemed strangely absent from Stoke Moran. Holmes halted beside the path. "It is essential," said he, "that you follow my instructions precisely." "I shall," Helen answered at once. "There must be no hesitation." His voice remained calm, though unusually firm. "When Dr. Roylott returns this evening, you will complain of illness and retire early." She nodded. "And afterward, when you hear him enter his chamber for the night, open your shutters and place a lamp in the window, a signal." "Precisely." Holmes glanced toward the distant road, where the village inn stood partly visible beyond the trees. My friend and I shall be watching from there. Helen hesitated, and then, you will quietly remove yourself to your former room and remain there until morning. Her face betrayed uncertainty. You truly mean to spend the night in that chamber? We do. I confess, I watched Holmes carefully. His decision surprised me little. Indeed, it accorded entirely with his character. But what struck me was the gravity beneath his composure. He looks not excited, not triumphant, but troubled. Helen studied him. I think, she said softly, that you already suspect the cause of my sister's death. Holmes remained silent a moment. I possess ideas, said he at last, but not certainty. Not yet. She drew closer. For pity's sake, Mr. Holmes, tell me at least whether Julia died from fright alone. Holmes's expression softened. No, he said quietly. The words seemed to chill even the mild afternoon air. I do not believe fear itself killed her. Helen's colour faded. Then there was something real? I believe so. She searched his face desperately. What? Holmes shook his head. I should prefer stronger proof before speaking. It was not evasiveness. I knew him too well. Holmes guarded conclusions carefully, particularly when lives still hung in uncertainty. He took her hand kindly. Be brave, Miss Stoner. If you do exactly as instructed, I trust this business may soon be ended. There was comfort in his tone. At length she inclined her head. I place myself entirely in your hands. We departed soon afterward. As we left the grounds, I glanced back once towards Stoke Moran. The old manor stood motionless against the pale sky, grey stone, broken roofline, dark windows. And though reason offered no explanation, I could not rid myself of the impression that the place watched us leave. The Crown Inn proved modest, but comfortable. Holmes secured cool upstairs rooms, commanding a clear view of the manor. From our window we overlooked both the avenue gate and the inhabited wing. There we settled, to wait. Evening descended gradually. Across the fields, long shadows gathered among the trees. The first lamps appeared in the village. Holmes sat near the window smoking thoughtfully, while I struggled to arrange the scattered clues into some coherent shape. At last I spoke. You are uneasy? He glanced sideways. Am I so transparent? To me, perhaps. Holmes smiled faintly. Then you observe correctly. I moved nearer. The ventilator? Yes. The bell rope? That also. He rested his pipe. My dear Watson, did you notice how neatly the bed aligned beneath both? I recalled the arrangement. The bed was fixed. Exactly. His eyes returned towards Stoke Moran. A bed that cannot move. A bell rope that does not ring. A ventilator opening into another room. He spoke slowly. Each, by itself, may be meaningless. Together, he let the thought trail away. I considered. You believe they serve some common purpose. I suspect they do. The fading daylight softened his sharp profile. There exists, said he quietly, a design hidden somewhere among those details. And Roylott? Holmes remained silent briefly. When a physician abandons conscience, he said at last, he becomes uniquely dangerous. The remark disturbed me. for Holmes seldom spoke so severely without cause. Darkness thickened outside. Around 7 o'clock we observed movement at the avenue gate. A trap approached. In it sat Dr. Grimesby Roylott. Even at distance, his great frame dominated the vehicle beside the small driver. The gate proved troublesome. We heard faint shouting carried upon the evening air. Then, suddenly, Roylott rose half from his seat, gesturing violently at the lad struggling with the latch. The anger, visible even from afar, confirmed Helen's portrait of him entirely. Moments later, the trap vanished toward the house. Soon afterward, a light glimmered among the windows. "He is home," said Holmes. The night deepened. We dined lightly. Holmes spoke little. I noticed that he smoked more than usual and drifted, often, into silence. At last, unable to contain myself longer, I said, "You have not told me everything." He looked toward me with curious kindness. "No. Then you suspect genuine danger tonight?" Holmes leaned back. "My dear fellow, The honesty of his answer struck me more sharply than reassurance would have done. I studied him. "You think I should remain behind?" For a moment he said nothing. Then, "I should regret exposing you unnecessarily. Can I assist?" "Possibly, greatly." "Then I stay." A faint warmth entered his expression. "You are a loyal companion, Watson." He stood and crossed to the window. Outside, Stoke Moran lay almost entirely dark now. Only one faint light burned among the trees. Holmes spoke without turning. "There may be unpleasantness before morning." I slipped my revolver discreetly into my pocket. The wait proved strangely reassuring. Then we waited, minute after minute. The inn grew quieter around us. Wind stirred softly through the trees beyond the fields. And at last, just as the church clock struck 11, a single lamp suddenly appeared at the centre window of Stoke Moran. Holmes sprang instantly to his feet. "That," said he quietly, "is our signal." And with those words, the long night truly began. There are nights which memory preserves, not as a sequence of events, but as a sensation, code, stillness, and the strange heaviness which settles upon the heart when danger approaches unseen. So, it was upon that unforgettable night at Stoke Moran, the instant Holmes observed the lamp shining from Miss Stoner's window, all traces of idleness vanished from him. "That is our signal," said he quietly. His movements became swift and economical. He extinguished our own lamp, secured his cane beneath his arm, and exchanged a few words with the landlord of the Crown, explaining that we might spend the night visiting acquaintances nearby. Within moments we stood outside. A chill wind moved across the Surrey fields, carrying with it the damp fragrance of earth and hedgerow. Above us, clouds drifted slowly across a pale moon, veiling and unveiling the countryside in uneasy intervals of silver light. Far ahead, among dark trees, Helen's signal glowed steadily. We crossed the road in silence. No words seemed necessary. I felt the reassuring weight of my revolver against my coat. though I confess my thoughts were far less steady than Holmes appeared to be. The grounds of Stoke Moran proved easy enough to enter. Age and neglect had left breaches as the old boundary walls, and we slipped through one such opening before making our way beneath the trees. The park lay strangely quiet. Branches stirred overhead. Now and again, dead leaves whispered beneath our feet, and always ahead burned that solitary yellow light. We had nearly reached the lawn when an extraordinary thing occurred. From a dense clump of laurels beside the path, there suddenly sprang a figure so unexpected that I nearly cried aloud. For an instant I believed it some malformed child. It flung itself forward upon twisted limbs, crouched low against the grass, and then darted away with astonishing speed into darkness. My hand seized Holmes' arm. "My God!" I whispered. "Did you see it?" To my surprise, even Holmes had recoiled slightly. His fingers closed tightly upon my wrist. Then, after a breathless moment, he exhaled softly and gave a muted laugh. "A pleasant household," he murmured near my ear. I stared after the vanished shape, the baboon. Only then did memory return. The doctor's strange animals. Yet, Holmes added quietly, "And we must remember there is a cheetah somewhere upon the grounds as well." The remark did little to steady me. Indeed, I confess I glanced more than once into the surrounding shadows as we crossed the lawn. At length we reached the window. Helen had kept her promise. The shutters stood ready. Holmes removed his shoes and motioned that I do the same. Then, with practiced silence, we climbed into the chamber where Julia Stoner had met her death. The room appeared precisely as before. The bed, the dummy bell rope, the dark oak panelling. Only now the familiar chamber possessed an altogether different aspect. By daylight it had seemed merely curious. By night it became oppressive. Holmes closed the shutters immediately and placed the lamp upon the table. Then he examined the room once more with rapid, searching eyes. Satisfied, he moved close beside me. His whisper was scarcely audible. "The least sound may ruin everything." I nodded. "We must sit in darkness." Again I nodded. "He may observe light through the ventilator." The explanation struck me unpleasantly. Holmes pointed toward my revolver. "Keep it ready." Then he arranged our vigil. He seated himself upon the edge of the bed. I took the wicker chair nearby. Beside Holmes rested his long cane, together with matches and the stub of a candle. At last he lowered the lamp. Darkness swallowed the room. How may I describe those hours? Even now, years later, recollection returns with unnerving clarity. The shutters excluded every glimmer of moonlight. We sat enclosed within absolute blackness. I could not see Holmes, could scarcely hear him, yet I knew he remained, awake, only feet away, every faculty strained toward the unseen chamber, beyond the ventilator. Outside, the night breathed softly around us. Once there came a distant cry from some nocturnal bird. Another time, far nearer, a long, low, feline sound drifted past the window. The cheetah The knowledge chilled me considerably. From somewhere across the countryside came the slow tolling of the parish clock, quarter hour after quarter hour, each seeming impossibly long. Midnight, then one. Still we waited. My legs had grown stiff. My eyes burned from peering uselessly into darkness. Yet sleep never approached me. There existed within that room too much tension for drowsiness. And through it all Holmes remained utterly motionless. At length, shortly after 2 o'clock, something changed. A faint glow appeared suddenly above, only for an instant. A narrow gleam from the ventilator. Then darkness returned. Almost immediately a new sensation reached us. Smell, burning oil, and heated metal. Someone in Dr. Roylott's chamber had opened the dark lantern. I heard, too, the faintest sound, movement, then silence once more. But the smell remained. The minutes crawl onward. My nerves had become stretched to painful sensitivity. I could hear the faint beating of my own pulse, and then, at last, there came a sound, so soft that at first I doubted it. A low, continuous noise, gentle, steady, like steam escaping from a kettle. The effect upon Holmes was instantaneous. He sprang upright with astonishing speed. A match flared. Sudden light burst through the darkness, and before my dazzled eyes could adjust, Holmes lashed violently upward with his cane toward the bell rope. "You see it, Watson," he shouted. "You see it?" But I saw nothing, only the swinging cord, the flash of light, and Holmes striking fiercely again and again. Then a whistle, low, sharp, and in the very next instant there erupted from somewhere beyond the wall a cry so dreadful that even now I cannot hear it in memory without unease. It began as a scream, then swelled into something far more terrible. Pain, rage, terror, all mingled within one horrible human shriek. It rang through the night with such force that I felt the blood chill in my veins. Holmes stood rigid beside the bed. The scream rose higher, then broke suddenly into silence. No sound followed, only the fading echoes drifting across. For several seconds, neither of us moved. I stared at Holmes. His face, pale beneath the matchlight, had grown grim beyond anything I had seen before. At last I found my voice. "What does it mean?" Holmes looked toward the ventilator. His expression was hard and terrible. "It means," said he quietly, "that the matter is finished." Then he seized the lamp, and perhaps, he added, for the best. For several seconds after that dreadful cry, neither Holmes nor I moved. The sound seemed still to tremble through the walls of Stoke Moran. Long after, silence had returned. I remember standing beside the bed with my revolver half raised, the lamplight wavering across the old chamber, while my pulse beat painfully in my ears. Holmes alone appeared composed. Though pale, he had regained that extraordinary command which never deserted him in moments demanding action. He seized the lamp and turned toward the corridor. "Bring your pistol, Watson." His voice was low, but carefully I followed at once. The corridor beyond lay dim and silent, the whitewashed walls casting back uncertain shadows from our lamp. Ahead stood the door of Dr. Roylott's chamber. Holmes paused. Twice he struck softly. No answer came. He tried again. Still silence. Then, with measured caution, he turned the handle and pushed the door inward. The sight awaiting us remains among the strangest I have witnessed in all my years beside Sherlock Holmes. The chamber stood illuminated by a dark lantern placed upon the table, its shutter partly raised, so that a narrow beam of yellow light cut sharply through the gloom. That beam fell directly upon the great iron safe. Its door stood open. Beside the table sat Dr. Grimes B. Royal. He wore a long grey dressing gown. His feet, thrust into Turkish slippers, rested motionless before him. Across his lap lay the curious lash we had noticed earlier, that strange cord tied into a small loop. At first I believed him merely frozen by shock. Then I saw his face. His chin tilted unnaturally upward. His eyes remained fixed toward the ceiling in the rigid and dreadful stare. And around his brow rested what appeared, in the uncertain light, to be a narrow yellow band marked with darker speckles. For one bewildered moment, I failed to understand what I saw. Then the band moved. I shall never forget that motion. Slowly, almost lazily, the thing unwound itself from his head. From beneath the tangled hair rose a flattened, diamond-shaped head, a neck swollen and gleaming, a serpent. The horror of it struck me like cold water. "It is the band!" I exclaimed. Holmes stepped forward instantly. "The Speckled Band," said he quietly. The snake reared slightly, its body still coiled among the dead man's hair. Even now the creature seemed hideously unnatural within that English bedroom, as though some fragment of distant jungle had intruded where it did not belong. Holmes's expression hardened. "A saupadder," said he, "one of the deadliest snakes in India." I confess I retreated involuntarily. The reptile's eyes glittered wickedly in the lantern light. Holmes, however, showed neither fear nor hesitation. With remarkable speed, he snatched up the dog-lash from Roylott's lap and cast its loop deftly around the serpent's neck. The creature writhed furiously, yet Holmes held firm, keeping it extended far from his body. Without another word, he crossed to the iron safe and thrust the reptile inside. A metallic clang echoed through the chamber. As the heavy door slammed shut, silence followed. Only then did I look fully again toward Dr. Roylott. Death had overtaken him swiftly. There could be no doubt of that. Upon his brow and temple I perceived two faint punctures, scarcely visible beneath the skin. His own weapon had returned upon him. For several moments, neither Holmes nor I spoke. The room smelled strongly of lamp oil and heated metal. The lantern still cast its narrow beam across the safe and table. while outside the night remained strangely undisturbed, as though nature herself had witnessed nothing. At length I found my voice. "Good Dr. Holmes!" He stood gazing toward the dead physician. "Violence," said he quietly, "has a habit of recoiling upon the violent." There was neither triumph nor cruelty in his tone, only sober reflection. "We must remove Miss Stoner at once," he continued, "and afterward notify the authorities." So ended the life of Dr. Grimesby Roylott of Stoke Moran. I shall not burden you with lengthy details of the official inquiry which followed. The poor and terrified Helen Stoner was conveyed safely to her aunt's care at Harrow before dawn, and the slow machinery of law eventually concluded, as such inquiries often do, that the doctor had met his death through reckless dealings with an exotic creature. Yet it was during our journey back to London the following day that Holmes fully explained the chain of reasoning which had led him toward the truth. The countryside rolled quietly beyond our carriage window, while morning mist drifted across the Surrey fields. Holmes sat opposite me, unusually thoughtful. "I began badly," said he at last. "Yup." He smiled faintly. "Indeed." The mention of gypsies and the dying words, "the Speckled Band," misled me entirely. I listened closely. "But when we examined the room," he continued, "the true pattern emerged." He counted the clues calmly. A ventilator opening us outdoors, but into Roylott's chamber, the dummy bell rope, the bed clamped firmly to the floor, and finally the chair. "The chair?" I asked. He nodded. "It showed signs of frequent use beneath the ventilator. Roylott stood upon it." Understanding dawned slowly. The snake. Precisely. Holmes gazed thoughtfully toward the passing fields. The rope served not as a bell pull, but as a bridge. The bed could not move, ensuring the sleeper remained directly beneath. He spoke with measured sadness. "A clever crime, Watson. Ingenious and monstrous. The whistle? To recall the creature before daylight. And the milk. A reward." I sat silent. The simplicity of it chilled me more deeply than any elaborate mystery might have done. Holmes folded his hands. "When a physician turns his knowledge toward cruelty," said he quietly, "he may become a most dangerous criminal indeed." The wheels rattled softly beneath us, and I remember looking out across the brightening countryside, while his words lingered in my thoughts. Thus ended the strange affair of the Speckled Band. Many adventures besides Sherlock Holmes have faded with time, yet sometimes, upon restless evenings, in London rain taps softly against the windows, memory returns, and once more I see that ancient house, the dark corridor, the lamp burning beside the bed, and hear, far away, in the silence, the whistle in the night.